David Sir, start.
Going on?
David Leiman. Ah, David Zoll is coming here. Ah, gewaltig. Good morning. I have the recording on.
Good morning.
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 You know, for the leaders of all the foreign countries, they don't know you congratulate, Nish congratulate. They don't know where to put themselves. Like the president of Mexico said, it wouldn't be appropriate to congratulate anybody before it's clear, but everybody else congratulated. These are I'm sure all the leaders of the countries are having these little kipkis. What should we do? Should we carry congratulate, this congratulate? Some of them, Yosy and chocolate of Shabbos. Zalam Nishik and chocolate of Shabbos. What's up with the team? Okay.
It's like you hear somebody got engaged, but it hasn't been announced yet, so.
That's right. Or no, in this case, you hear someone got engaged and they announced it when the word went out, but you heard the shidduch is wackeling, you don't know if it's gonna fall apart. I remember when the first time I was in the mirror, the first Zman I came to the mirror, I learned a lesson. And from that lesson, I learned that if someone gets engaged, I will not wish the family mazel tov if a week has transpired since the engagement became official. Because I was there, it was my first day in the mirror. In those days, it was a big besmedrash. And Binyamin Eisenstark, who's from Montreal, he was a chassan. And he was standing all the way on the other side of the besmedrash. And I screamed out to him, Binyamin, mazel tov. And then the guy never gives me a pinch and says, his engagement broke yesterday. So ever since then, I don't wish mazel tov to people if it's a week past it. So that's the same thing. You wish Biden a mazel tov, but his shidduch might have broken. Okay, listen.
My cousin Joey Oliver Shalom, you remember Joey?
Oh, he had Joeyisms.
Yeah. So one of them was that, he went to the basic forest, he had Yurtzai, and he sees a friend there that he hasn't seen in like 40 years. And he said, oh, how you doing? How you doing? What are you doing here? She says, my wife died last year. Oh, I didn't even know you were married. Mazel tov.
Exactly.
That's a Joeyism.
So we had halacha yesterday that sometimes putting up a wall can add a chumrah. For instance, we learned the halacha that if you have this wall up, then if there's a wall up between your gefanim and your zroyim, then we look at it like you're planting the zroyim. So the case was you had a big chutzner and a little chutzner, and there were gefanim planted in the big chutzner. If you plant zroyim in the little chutzner, even though they're 4 amos away from the gefanim, but since there's a little chutzner, we consider it part of the big chutzner, and it's going to make it also. So the fact that there's actually a Pesach there, the fact that there's a barrier there, in fact, makes it worse, because without a barrier, a harchaka 4 amos would have been enough. Now that there's a barrier, we consider it a problem, and we consider it klaya kerem. So Rabbi Yochanan said, do you ever find such a thing? Do you ever find such a thing that mechitza can make it more chumradik? So the Gemara was bringing different examples of where a mechitza might make it more chumradik. And Rabbi Yochanan kept on saying, you don't have a raya from there. That's not the mechitza that made it more chumradik. It's a side issue that was caused by the mechitza that might have made it more chumradik. So the last shtickle that we had was the brisa that said that mechitza is in a kerem, and that's about 8 lines down from the top of Daf Tzaddik Gimel Amud Aleph. Mechitza is in the kerem. If you have mechitza in the kerem, oh, I forgot my pointer. If you have mechitza in the kerem, sometimes that can be a chumrah and sometimes that can be a kula. So the brisa told us, when is it a kula? Kerem hanatua ad ikar mechitza. You had a kerem with a wall around it, and you planted vines right up and against the actual mechitza. Zoreya meikar mechitza ve'elech. Immediately on the other side of the mechitza, without any herchik at all, you're allowed to start planting other minim. She'ilu ain't sham mechitza. If there wasn't a mechitza there, marchik dalet amis, you would be forced to leave a fallow, a gap of dalet amis in between the gefen and the zera. But v'zeh who mechitza is the kerem lahakol. There you see an example of how a mechitza, making a wall between the vines and other zroim, in fact, gives you a kula because you no longer have to wait the 4 amos. Ulahachmer, where do you find a wall makes a chumrah? Ketzat, hayamachshuch min hakoshel yud aleph amo. What if you had a wall around a vineyard and there was 11 amos of fallow earth between the vine and the wall? So 11 amos sounds like a lot of space. Nevertheless, loy yovi zera l'sham. Even if you have 11 amos, so you can be 10 amos away and plant in the last amma, you still can't plant something else there. Now, right off the bat, if there was no fence there, 4 amos would have been enough to leave. And now that there's a wall there, in fact, you have to wait 11 amos. Ilmali ein mechitza. Ilmali ein mechitza. If there was no mechitza at all, marchik dal ramas. Yeah, I can see. I keep it. You shut up. Marchik dal ramas. You'd have to only wait 4 amos. You'd only have to leave 4 amos in between the geffen and the new plants. V'zareya, and then you could plant. So v'zuhi mechitzas hakerem lahachmer. So this is an example of where a mechitza could make a chumrah. Amr lei. So Rabbi Yochanan told him. Or I'm sorry, it's Abaye. I'm mixing it up. It's Amalei Rab Chanan Labaye. And here we had Rava kept on getting slugged up by Abaye. So finally, Rava sent this attack in the hands of Shmaya Bar Zira. Right? We had 3 kashas where Rava challenged Abaye and Abaye deflected it. So I guess the 4th time Rava was already embarrassed. So he sent Shmaya with the 4th kasha to see how he would do. And this is the kasha that Shmaya presented. And on that, Abaye said, you're asking me a kasha, proving to me from this brisa that a barrier can sometimes make it worse. Why would you ask me a kasha from a brisa? There's a Mishnah that also says something similar to you. So you could have asked me the same kasha from the Mishnah, and then I'm going to tell you why it's not a kasha. It's not we learned. What if there's a bald spot in the kerem? In other words, there's an area in the middle of a kerem that was left unplanted, so it's left fallow. In order for you to be able to plant another a row of some other zera in that fallow space, there would have to be 24 amos of fallow space. Basil says, it would only have to be 16 amos of fallow space. And we're going to get into the cheshbon of how that works out in a moment. What about if there's not a fallow space in the center of a kerem, rather at the edge of a kerem? That means between the border, the barrier, the wall, the fence around the kerem, and the closest plant, 16 amos will it allow you to plant there. And the Bishamay says 16 amos, so it's 8 amos less than if it's a blank middle of the kerem. What is an example of karachas kerem? Kerem shechorav emtziusa. A kerem that some plants in the center of it were eliminated. So im ein sham tesayin amma, and this of course is going according to Beis Hill. If there's not 16 amma of fallow space, lo yavi zera l'sham. You're not allowed to plant inside there. Ho yusham tesayin amma. But if there was a 16 ammas of blank space, noisin loy kadeh avaydasa. You leave to the kerem the amount of space it needs to work around it, which means you have to leave 4 amos adjacent to each kerem. So you have 2 walls. You have kerem on one side and kerem on the other side. So right off the bat, you have to subtract 4 amos from the kerem on one side, 4 amos from the kerem on the other side. And Rashi tells us the 4 amos is because when you have a kerem, you need to be able to bring in service to the kerem, and service requires a rig. That's a pair of oxen and other tools, and you need a 4 amma, an 8-foot wide lane. You need fallow around each plant so that you can access it with your rig. So right away you need 4 amos and 4 amos. So out of the 16 amos that Beis Hillel holds you need, 8 amos off the bat you need because you have to leave those empty to service the kerem. And then v'zareyas and moiser, and the 8 amos in the middle you can plant, because you have to be you have to have a significant amount of land that you can say is not part of the kerem. Normally, if there's a blank space in the middle of the kerem, you would say it's bottled to the kerem, and you're not allowed to plant a foreign plant in a kerem. But if you leave the kerem 4 amos of service space on either side, and now you have 8 amos in the middle, 8 amos in the middle is considered a choshev amount of space that we could say it's distinct from the kerem around it, and it's its own area where you could now plant other things. Beis Shammai, who hold it has to be 24, it's because he holds you still need the 4 amos on either side. So 24 minus 8 is 16. And Beis Shammai holds in order to be a distinct area that you could say is not part of the kerem, you need more space in order to be able to do that. And when you're talking about the mechayla kerem, ezel mechayla kerem, it's beina kerem lekeder. That's if you're not in between 2 rows of vines, you only have a vine on one side, and on the other side there's a wall. Shem ein sham yud beizama, Beis Hillel holds there you need 12 amos, lo yavi zera l'sham. But if there was 12 amos, hoya sham yud beizama, then noisin like kedei avodah. So the same cheshbon, out of the 12 amos, 4 amos closest to the vine, to the row of vines, you need for the service corridor. 12 minus 4 is 8. You have 8 left, according to Beis Hillel. 8 is considered a distinct enough area, a large enough area that we could say it's its own area. It's not part of the kerem. Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai holds you would need 16 for that. So that's why 16 plus 4 is 20. That's why Beis Shammai holds you need. What does Beis Shammai hold you need for mechayla kerem? Mechayla kerem, Beis Shammai, you need 16 amos. I'm sorry. So you need 4. Right, you need 4. You need 4 against the wall as well. You need 4 against the wall, and the reason why you need 4 against the wall is because you're not allowed to plant against the wall. The Gemara will tell us in a second, because they'll ruin the wall. So let's do it. And you can plant the rest. Zogt the Gemara elahasam. So what Abaye told him. So why did you ask me for a brisa? You have this Mishnah that in fact says the same thing. The fact that there's a wall there means that you have to be further away, because if there's no wall there, all you had to do was stay away 4 amos. Elahasam lafanu taima. The reason why over there you need more space is nothing to do with the wall. It's because of a practical difference that the wall makes, but that's not a halacha that could get the king. It's just because it creates a reality. Hainu taima. The Bach's word here is important. Lav hainu taima isn't the reason there because the chol dalat amis legabe akerem avodas akerem. You always have to be 4 amos away from the kerem because you need that as a service corridor. And legabe geder and legabe the wall, kivan the loy misdairon. Nobody plants right up against the wall. You know why? Whenever you have 2 houses that are being built very close together, if you excavate right near someone's retaining wall, someone's basement wall, his house will collapse. So that's why nowadays, when they want to excavate very close to another house, they have to do something called shoring, which is a very, very expensive process. And they actually pound like 20, 30-foot steel columns into the ground along the house that you're digging near. And in between those steel beams, they put in wooden planks, and they're literally holding up the earth from caving in. Doing that on a home nowadays can cost you $80,000 to $100,000 just to do the shoring. Because if you're digging too deep near your neighbor's house, you can have his whole house shift. So you have to do that. So the same thing would happen if you start digging and planting right up against the wall of a kerem, you could weaken its foundation and cause it to shift. So kivan, the loy misdaron, since you can't plant there, afkurim afkulahu, no one's going to plant there. You can't consider that part of any space. And the beni, so the 8 amos in the middle, as long as you have 4 amos, you're going to be fine. So that's why Beis Hillel holds you need 12 amos, 4, which is going to be your distinct area, 4 against the wall, which doesn't count, and 4 against the kerem. Beis Shammai holds a distinct area is always 8, so it's 8 plus 4, which is 16. So at the end of the day, Dr. Abaye, you never were able to find me a case that illustrates that the halachic impact of a wall creates a chumrah. In all these cases, it wasn't a halachic impact. It was because the wall being there created a certain reality. But it's not a halachic impact of a barrier that created a chumrah. Okay, Dr. Haley, more about you. Now we're getting into a new sugya.
These pictures are not not very practical either. The guy on the wagon in the art scroll I'm talking about has got no way to get out. Just
if he's driving along, how is he going to get out?
Yeah, so
Well, he could go straight to the end and get out on the end.
The plants are all enclosed in my pictures. I don't know about
this. I have this. Do you have something more realistic than mine?
Oh,
so you have a newer edition.
The donut, there's no way to get inside.
Yeah, I've got
a small spot in the middle.
No, because they always leave a corridor of 4 amas.
The pictures don't show.
Oh, they don't show that. Yeah.
but not to get out of the place. The guy's got a wagon and an oxen.
How do I get in?
No, they would have to be, because in between the rows of a camera, we actually learned that if you don't leave enough space in between the rows of kerem, that's also not considered a kerem, because it's also leyoker. You're for sure going to end up uprooting some of them because you need to be able to service them. So in order for it to be considered a kerem, it has to be built with enough access to be able to service the kerem properly. Unlike a boiler room, which never requires any access at all. Okay, Zog to Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda, Gimel Karfifos. So what is a karpif? A karpif is an area middle of nowhere that you created a barrier around for whatever reason because you wanted to use it. So let's look at Rashi. Rashi gives a nice definition to how a karpif works. We learned these halachos already, but Rashi gives us a very nice refresher course. So Rashi says over here, Gimel Karfifos zeh b'tzad zeh. Kagoy choyim halcha b'derech. Rashi is even telling us why someone would make a karpif. There's a group of people that are traveling, and they end up being stuck for Shabbos in the middle of the wilderness, and they need to be able to carry within their camp. And therefore, they kivu gimel karfifos ledira. They created 3 fenced-in areas to live there. In other words, not permanently, but to spend Shabbos there. B'mechitza shal shasi. So one of the things that indicates that it's a karfif, that it's not such a permanent arrangement, is you had the posts. It wasn't a regular wall. You had a series of vertical posts, kigoin shel konim. So you had a series of vertical reeds that created some type of perimeter fence around the area where you're planning to spend Shabbos. Or they're running horizontal. So you have thin posts with strings running across. Under such circumstances, we don't consider that hukaf. We don't consider the Reshus HaYochid within the perimeter that you've created, which would then allow you to carry there, only up to a maximum space of a base Hosai. That's the maximum amount of space that we allow. Like we learned in the first parak. And someone, Chaim Tzvi, said yesterday that in Eruvin we find now towards the end of the Masechta, everything we're learning is a rerun. There's no more new. It's not a new season. Everything's a rerun. And Chaim Tzvi said, since Eruvin is so difficult, or Shmuel said it, maybe Shmuel said it.
Everything's a rerun. I said.
Oh, Shmuel, since Eruvin is so difficult, and Chazal, no, we're not going to come back here for another 7.5 years. They want us to really chazer it well before we say goodbye to this Masechta, so that we'll remember all the things that we learned. So we learned that a karvish like Ladira is a Reshus HaYochid, but they limited the size of it to a base of sign, which is pretty big, right? It's 5,000 square amas. However, the Shayara muteres lahakav kol tzarchan. If it's 1 or 2 people, which is called a yochid, there Chazal limited the perimeter that you're allowed to make into a Reshus HaYochid. But if you're coming with a group, then you have a group rate. And then the area that you enclose could be as big as you need to be able to suit your needs. The area could be as big as you need to suit your needs. But if it's only for a single person, he cannot create a perimeter that's more than the base of Sayim. So if you make a proper permanent wall, then even a yochid can enclose a larger area. But when you talk about a flimsy, temporary type of partition, a yochid, so 1 or 2 people are limited to a base of Sayim. A rabbin, which is 3 people, we don't limit the size of the area that you can enclose. Rather, as much space as you need, you can include in the perimeter. So Zok the Heilige Gemara. Now that we have that introduction, we can look at what we have over here. So you had Gimel Karfifos Zebetz Hadze. They created 3 Karfifos. Ushnaim Hachitzonim Migufafin, the Emtzoi Einem Migufaf. The 2 outer ones are larger, and the center one is smaller. So it looks like a dumbbell, where you have a narrower section in the center, which would be the bar that you lift, connected to 2 larger sections on the side. So what it really creates is 2 sets of a large chutzner opening up into a small chutzner. That's really what it is, because the karfif in the center, and you can see the drawing, it looks like a dumbbell. The karfif in the center is the small chutzner, and on either side of it, it opens to a bigger chutzner. Now remember, we had this halacha. It was a little bit difficult to understand, but we were discussing how the small chutzner is sort of just an add-on, an appendage of the big chutzner, but the big chutzner is not an appendage of the small chutzner. So we look at the small chutzner as if it's connected to the big chutzner, but we don't look at the big chutzner as if it's connected to the small chutzner. And that's what started this whole thing, right? That got us into the shaila of klayim, which we just finished dealing with. It got us into the shaila of if you can tar a minion, if there's soya in there, if there's a problem, the shlich tziburs, if there's a problem, if you throw a woman a get, if there's a problem. So now we're discussing how it connects these things together for the purposes of carpet. So what we had is the 2 outer carpets were bigger, and the center one was not maguf, it was smaller. V'yochid bazeh. And Rashi tells us there was 3 individuals. There was 1 person in each of these 3 carpets. So the question is, do we look at it like there's 3 people here, and now they could have unlimited space, as much as they need? Or do you look at it like 3 carpets that each is inhabited by only 1 person, and they're limited to a base society? So the halacha is
The center carpet only has 2 walls, even 2 temporary walls.
correct.
That would be considered a carpet.
I guess so. Yeah. So nasa kishayara, v'noisten lahen kol tzarchan. We treat it like they're all together. Why? 1 second. Let me. I got lost. So Gimel gives zevet ushnai mechitzonim megufafin v'hamtzoi ein megufaf v'yochid b'zeh nasa kishayara v'noisten lahen. Let me see what the base says. V'noisten lahen kol tzarchan. We treat them like it's one big thing. So let's see what Rashi says, because Shlomi is asking a very good kasha. The center one isn't a carpet at all; it's wide open. So let's see what it says. The outer ones are wider than the inner one. The center one is open to both sides, right? Because it's completely missing the wall on either end. The gifufein oitfin alof. And looking from the ends, from the bigger carpets into the smaller one, you have those 2 shoulders where it becomes smaller to connect to the smaller area. So Rashi sticks in the 3rd one. Nasu shiyara b'noitlan kol tzarchan. Damrion, we say the yurei gedolim b'katan. We say that the people who live in the big one is also connected to the people who live in the little one. V'nimstu shloshton b'mtzoi, because the middle area, which is a smaller area, is considered both an appendage of the carpet on the right and an appendage of the carpet on the left, which ultimately means that middle section really combines everybody. Kom techois, the middle section is a section that's holding 3. So therefore, hamtzoi mitzarfon umuter emtzoi zeh. And Rashi says very clearly, it's only the center one that halachically is considered like 3 people are in. Umuter emtzoi zeh. So these 3 people made an eruv together. In the center area, you'd be able to have an unlimited amount of space, but the 2 ends are still considered areas that are only inhabited by one person, and they would have to stay below a base asayim. Other Rishonim argue in Rashi and say that since they're all connected, once the center one is unlimited, the rest of them will also be unlimited. Now, what about Shloimi's kasha, that the center one doesn't have any wall at all? I guess since it's connected to the other two karpos, and the other two karpos do not create an issue for them, it's considered closed up. Because it's open to a chutzner that's not usher to it, it's open to a chutzner that's mutter to it. And since it's open to a chutzner that's mutter to it.
The question that it's the definition is a carpet. That is, I understand what the example of the Morris case is trying to do. It's creating a corridor between two larger
Correct.
areas. Yeah.
Okay. So in order to have four walls, we must be relying on the fact that they're connected, because you have to, you have to have four walls.
The result shows
Yeah.
us that.
Okay, so Zok Gemara. Vadai emtsoi megufov ushnei machitzonim eina megufavim. I'm not sure what this Loshen Vadai is over here. I'm not sure what I did with this yesterday when I was preparing. So let's do the Noislam called Tzarcham. Vadai emtsoi megufov. Let me see what the article. How does the article explain this?
He shows the box takes it up.
Oh, it takes that completely?
And that's what the article.
At the back. Okay. So I'm trying Megufov. What if it's exactly the opposite? That the area in the middle, the center carpet, is larger than the two outer carpets. So I'm trying Megufov. If the center one is bigger and has sort of the four walls, so now you have the center one is a larger one, and the on either side you have the smaller chaseres. And there's one person in each carpet, then ein nosen lahem ella by base sheish. You only give them 6 base saw because each area is entitled to 2 base saw. 2 times 3 is equal to 6. So let's see what Rashi says. Emtsoy megufaf v'chitzonim ein megufafin shu rochav mahen. The center carpet is wider than the 2 sides. V'hen pesuchim loy b'miluyah. They're fully open to the center carpet. Ulidei have a miluyah. But for the center one, the 2 walls aren't fully open because the center one is bigger than the 2 sides. So then, ein loisn lem ela besa sign l'chol carpet. They don't have unlimited. Rather, they're limited to a base or a sign for each carpet. Sharei ein shloisha diyurin be'echad. We don't have any halachically a case where all 3 people are considered gathered in one of these 3 carpets. The diyurei emtsoi b'chitzonim. Because we say each of these sides are add-ons to the center, not the opposite. So therefore, if you go to one side, you only have 2. And in the center, there's only 1. And if any one of these 3 carpets would be larger than the base of Saim, who usher, it would be usher. And if the center one was Yosy base of Saim, then kulam asurim, they would all be usher. Because if the center one will be usher, it's going to impact its 2 neighbors on either side that are fully open to it. So that's what the Gemara starts off. So now the Gemara wants to know, Iboilu, what would happen if echad bazeh, in the 2 outer carpets, there was only 1 person, but shnayim b'emtzoi, there were 2 people in the center carpet. Ma, what would you say? Ilahacha nafki talosahavu. If you connect the center one to the right side, you have a total of 3. The ilahacha nafki, and if you connect the center one to the left side, again tlasahavu. So maybe then you're allowed to make any one of these karpifim even more than the base of Saim. You don't do that. When you have an area that has a connection to either side, what you do is chad lahacha nafik, the chad lahacha nafik. You split it, that one person you say connects to one side, one person connects to the other side, and then you don't have one area that has 3 people, and therefore you're still limited to a base of side. And if you're going to learn l'chumra, that's how it would go, that's how you would split it up, and therefore you need to have a maximum of base asayim. What would be if shnayim bazeh, ushnayim bazeh? You had 2 people on either side, the echad be'emt, and there's only 1 person in the middle. Do you say hachavadai No matter which side you connect the center to, there's going to be three, and therefore you should be able to make the carpet as big as you need it to be. It remains a suffix, since we don't know which side to allot the center fellow to. They both have to go l'chumra, and you're not allowed to make this area more than a base of side. So tomorrow, we paskin l'kula. Rashi says sheilu seinu edel hakel we're makel. So there are those who ask, why is the Gemara making this big deal that here the halachas l'kula, all of these shilas are only shilas of a derabbanan, and you always say safek derabbanan l'kula. So what's unique about this? So there's a lot of different svaras offered, but one of the svaras that's offered is safek derabbanan l'kula means on the b'diavad. If something happened already and it's a safek in the mitzias, what occurred, we'll say that you can go l'kula. But when you have a shaila of a lechatchila, who to paskin like, there you would not necessarily say safek derabbanan l'kula, and that's why we need a special proclamation over here that you go l'kula. That was one svar. Other svar the Rishonim offer is, we always learned that whenever you have multiple shilas and there's a ve'imtim tzaloimer, then what's the question by B? Ve'imtim tzaloimer, we always assume that the Gemara is paskening like the ve'imtim tzaloimer. So in this case, we said ve'imtim tzaloimer, if you have one here and one there, what would you be if you have two people? So you would think that we're paskening like those three imtim tzaloimers. Kamashvalon, we're not paskening on any of the shilas. You go l'kula on everything. So
is that like a general rule when the Gemara goes into multiple
you usually paskin like it
on a previous sock?
Yeah, that's usually how it works. But there's always exceptions, like in this case.
Yeah,
but usually we're paskin like the Vimtim Slav. Rab Chisda said, I would just pose a question to the Olam. I didn't understand it, and I didn't have time to work it out. If you look at the Art Scroll picture, the way they depict the small carpet opening up to the big carpet, is they have the barriers going a little bit inside. You see that? And I'm looking at the pictures on 93A3. I remember we learned the sugya of carpet. I remember why it had to be that way, but I don't remember now why it had to be that way. Why it's showing that the walls of the smaller chutzner move a little bit into the big chutzner. There was a reason for it. I think there was. Otherwise, you'd say.
Well, one's the first case and one's the second case. No?
I'm sorry. No, I understand, but you know how it shows when the smaller chutzner opens up to the bigger chutzner, it actually shows that the walls on the smaller chutzner extend into the bigger chutzner a little bit.
Compare the article picture to the one in Taisvus.
The one in Taisvus shows they're not sticking in. So there was a reason for it, and I was just trying to remember why. And off the top of my head, I can't remember why, but I know there's definitely a reason for it. It's just my amaratzis. That's I don't remember.
In the second case, it looks really odd, right? Because it looks like there's two.
But there was a reason for it, and I don't remember. We discussed the Gemara if it's on center. We learned the sugya of one chutzner opening up to another chutzner. If it's on center, if it's too close to one side, you'd say love it. There's a lot of rate on that. I don't remember the details now. What's that? Okay, Zak the Hel Gemara.
Well, if the wall was connected.
Why can't it just be a corner? Why does?
If it was a corner, then it's like the case where we had a bigger yard and a smaller yard, then it's only good from one way to the other.
Right. The Gemara is considering it that way. The Gemara is actually working on that principle here. That's why we say if two is here and one is there, you can connect this way, you can't connect that way, because that doorway acts like a one-way doorway. Gidot Chamisha. What happened if you have two chatzeres that are side by side, but they're not on the same grade? So you have one chatzer that's actually 5 tvachim elevated from the other side, from the other chatzer, and you have a wall in between. So the first 5 tvachim of the wall is actually up against, it's actually a retaining wall for the area with the higher elevation. And then there goes another 5 tvachim high. So from one side, if you're on the lower side and you look at the wall, it looks like it's 10 tvachim high. But if you're on the other side of the wall and you look at it, you only see a wall that's 5 tvachim high. So together, chamisha mechitza chamisha, ein mitzarfin, they're not mitzarf. Ad sheyehei oy kuloi begidut, oy kuloi b'mechitza. Either the barrier has to be only an elevation difference, or it has to be a full wall. You can't go half and half. So the Gemara is going to drill down to analyze the perspective. In other words, you will perceive the wall one way when standing at the lower elevation than you would perceive it if you're standing by the higher elevation. So the Gemara is going to explain. But right now the Gemara says is it's not a good wall. It has to be either all being an elevation issue or all being a wall. You cannot have half and half. The Gemara. We had this, Shiloh, once again, we're chazering a Mishnah that we had already. So one chatzar is 10 tefachim above in elevation, above the lower chatzar. So that's one option. Or you had half and half, which is exactly the shaila that our Gemara just raised. So the halacha is ma'arvin shnayim ve'in ma'arvin echad. That tells you that these are two separate chatzeres. That means this barrier is a proper partition. It's a proper partition, and therefore they cannot make an eruv together. There's no door in between these two chatzeres, and therefore they have to make their own separate eruv. Pachas mikan. What if it was less than a total of 10 tefachim? Ma'arvin echad. Then there's no barrier here at all. And again, then they have to combine the Eruvin because they're considered one large chaser. The Einam Arvin Shnayim. So the problem is, how could you tell me Gidut Chamisha, Umachitza Chamisha, Ein Mestarfin, and then it's not considered a wall? The Mishnah seems to say very explicitly that if you have 5 of elevation difference and 5 of wall, it is considered a proper wall. So Gemara, I think it's Omar Rava. I think the base changes to Rava. Yeah, Moida Rav Chisda v'tachtoina. Rav Chisda is Moida that it's considered a good wall if you're on the lower elevation and you're looking up. You see 10 tefachim a barrier. 5 might be retaining wall, 5 might be added wall, but from the perspective of the people in the lower elevation, you see a full wall. Hoyel v'roya pnei asara, because you see a full wall. So what it means is, Dr. Rashi, the legabo have a mechitza. From the perspective of the lower chatzar, it's a mechitza. Aval gabe el yoino. But if you're standing on the upper chatzar, lav mechitza. It's not a mechitza. And Rashi says in a very important reason, she'eina roya es pnei asara lemechitzasa. You cannot see when you're standing on your side, all you see is a wall of 5. And you can't look down because there's a big wall in between you and the cliff. So if all you had was a difference in elevation, then you could walk right up to the edge of your chutzner and look down 10 tefachim. But since now you have a wall that's 5 tefachim high, you actually can't get right to the edge to look down. And therefore, from your perspective, we say you don't have a full wall. If it was all of an elevation difference of Rashi, shaper tefei would be better. Because I actually have access to horizontal plane right up to the drop. And at the drop, if I look down, you'll see that there's a 10 tefach elevation difference. If now that you have a partial wall, you don't see a full difference in time. If that's the case, so if you're saying there's a difference in how we view this wall for the lower elevation and for the upper elevation, then the people on the lower elevation who have a full wall of 10 tefachim, they have to make their own eruv. They cannot join in the eruv with the chatzar that's in the higher elevation. El yoina lo yisarv lo yachad v'lo shnayim. The el yoina, they can't make an eruv with the people who are below them because the people who are below them have a wall. Yet they can't make an eruv for themselves because they're still open to the neighbor who's below them. So they're stuck without anything. So let's see, Rashi. They can make their own eruv in the lower elevation, but they cannot combine with the upper chatzar. Because from their perspective, there's a full wall of 10 tefachim. The yoina is totally messed up. They have no option at all. The lower chatzar answers them because they don't really have a mechitza from their perspective. And they cannot make it there together with the tachtoina. From the perspective of the people in the lower elevation, there's no connection. So they're stuck. And that's what the halacha would mean. So going back to the Mishnah that we quoted, that if it's half and half, my Eruvin Shnayim, my Eruvin Echad, that's talking about the people on the bottom. But the people on top have no Eitzah at all. Zok to Gemara, Ihaki Dachtani Ta'arav Shnayim, V'loy Ta'arav Echad, Al Yoyin Lo Yachad Lo Shnayim, Amar Rabba Be'ula, Kegoyin Shehoisa El Yoina Megufefes Ad Eser Amos. What you have over here is the wall, that the retaining wall of the 5 Amos, that is the area where it's above grade, even on the upper level. That wall doesn't go across the entire chutzner. That wall leaves an opening of less than 10 Amos. So the picture that I'm looking at is the diagram number D on 93B1. So the wall doesn't come all the way up. The wall actually stops halfway down. If that's the case, so let's see what Rashi is. But megufefes, mechitza asora ala gido. There is a mechitza of 10 above the grade of the upper level. Ad eser amas emtsoyis, but they left an opening of 10 in that barrier. Shehindichu kein pesach. They left it like an opening there. They didn't completely fill in that wall with mechitza, rather they left an opening. All they left was a mechitza of 5. Ve'agidud chamisha, and you only have a barrier of 5. They could both make an erev for themselves. Ve'ein zu oiseres al zu. They will not answer one or the other. From the bottom perspective, you have a wall of even more than 10 tefachim. It's a mechitza that has a door in it, and therefore they have a decision to make if they want to join with the guys on the bottom or not. If they decide they don't want to join with the guys on the bottom, then they can make their own erev. But they still cannot make an erev together with the people on the lower elevation. So the picture shows where on the upper level they actually had a full mechitza of 10, but that full mechitza of 10 didn't cross their entire property. So therefore, they can either be considered connected to the lower level or not connected to the lower level. So therefore, they have an option of making their own personal erev. Zog to Gemara, says Pachas Mikam, if you don't have a full 10 tefachim, then Ma'arvin Echad, Ve'ein Ma'arvin Shnayim, then they only could make one erev together because there's no proper wall in between them. Iboy Chate Arev, Iboy Treite Arev. You see from here, it's Pachas become Ma'arvin Echad, Ve'ein Ma'arvin Shnayim. They could only do it together, and they can't do it separately. But the problem is the way we're learning that the wall on top is considered like a Pesach. Well, then they should have a choice, because there's a wall with a Pesach in it, and then either side they can both decide to make the erev together or make it separately. Why are you saying that they have to be ma'arvin echad? They have to be ma'arv together, right? The Pachas Mikan, if it was less than a full 10 tefachim, then they would have to be ma'arv together. But the way we're learning that you still have a full 10 tefachim on either side of the opening, so that they should have the option of making an erev separately or together, because it's a regular wall with a pesach in it. The problem here is the tachtoina. If you look at the picture of diagram E, the way it worked is that now from the tachtoina's perspective, you don't have 10 tefachim at all, because it's completely open. The area of the Pesach was left completely open to the point where you don't have a full 10 tefachim anymore of height, even if you're standing at the lower elevation.
That's what I was saying. So in the Halloween,
Sorry. You're assuming it's more than 10 amos, the opening area.
The opening was less than 10 amos. The opening had to be less than 10 amos, so therefore we could look at them as if there's a barrier in between them, or you could look at it as if there's no barrier in between them. That's what a Pesach gives you an option to either join or to stay separate.
But in the Halloween, that's only from the Yoda's perspective, because from the Tachtoina's
Correct.
perspective, there's a full 10 tefachim.
Correct.
That's the Gemara's kasha. The Gemara then says well, that can't be because there's no option anymore.
Exactly.
It have to be separate. So now the Gemara changes, it says, no, the cutout.
Is lower. The cutout comes down lower, and it's now impacting even the 10 tvachim of wall from the perspective of the lower elevation. Zok the Gemara. So let's see here. The Gemara. El Yoni boy trade Rabbi boy chater. The Gemara enechnami. V'chikatani pachas mikan ma'arvin echad. They ma'arvin shtayim atachtoina. When it says that if it's less than that, they have to make one Erev and they can't make two Eruvin, that's referring to the lower one. Because the lower one has no longer has a mechitza of 10 tvachim, separating it from the upper. Zok de l'gemor v'ater. Dorish meremer. Gidud chamisha u'mechitza chamisha. If you have a level difference, an elevation of 5 and a mechitza 5, which is the exact shaila that we're discussing, mitzdarfin. So Meremar is saying exactly the opposite of what we said at the beginning of it. At the beginning of it, the Mandamar said, who was that Mandamar who said it? It was Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said, Gidud Chamisha Mechitz Chamish is not Mitzaref. Meremar held that it wasn't Mitzaref. He argues on Rav Chisda. So we have over here now a dispute. Is this considered a good barrier or not? Ashkechei Ravina l'Rav Acha Barei Derava. Ravina found Rav Acha Barei Derava, and he asked him, let me see what the Bach says, and he asked him, he asked him, Omar, a Meimar, Midi b'mechitza, did a Meimar ever express an opinion about this halacha of whether or not you can combine the elevation difference with the wall to create a mechitza of 10? Omar, no, a Meimar never said anything, so I can't help you with this. And the Gemara for Zois, the Hilchasa Gidud Chamisha, Umechitza Chamisha Mitzdarfin, halacha l'mai says it is a good wall.
So there's never all on top of the oven, nobody, it was just a mistake.
Rav Chisda holds it's not a good wall.
That was
Yeah. Boy, Rav Hoshi, the urine habon b'Shabbos. We have this shaila of what happens if before Shabbos comes along. So Rashi says you have a koisel between two chatzeres. So if you have a koisel between two chatzeres, we have our own personal erev in our chatzer, and you have your own personal erev in your chatzer, and the wall falls down on Shabbos. So the urine haboim b'Shabbos means now your neighbors just became your guests. It's a nice way of saying your wall fell down. Your wall fell down, and now you're sharing a chutzah with your neighbor. So they now ask you. You didn't make an erev together with them. So when Shabbos arrived, everything was good, and then the wall broke down, and there was a status change on Shabbos. Will that impact you? That's really the whole shaila. If when Shabbos started, everything was okay, and then something changed, do you say it's usher, or do you say since when Shabbos started, everything was okay, it's good for the entire Shabbos? We had the shaila from the erev breaks. That's right. Once Shabbos starts, it's okay. Amar Rav Chisda. Let me just see the base again. Amar Rav Chinina. Tashma. Chatzar gedoyla shenifra shalaktana. Our Mishnah, a big chatzar that opens up into a small chatzar, had gedoyla muteres vaktana asura. Mipnei shika pescha shel gedoyla. So for some reason, the Gemara is assuming that this break, when did it break? It broke on Shabbos. So you see, if it breaks on Shabbos, it does change the status quo. And Rabbi, no, the Mishnah is discussing a case where coming into Shabbos, it was already in this situation. Abaye told him, Loi tema mar. Amar, don't say, maybe I can say in the Mishnah the case is where this breach occurred before Shabbos. You have to learn, shot in the Mishnah, is that when Shabbos arrived, it's already in this situation. The Hamar the Amar, you yourself said, I asked the same shaila both of Rav Huna and of Rav Yehuda, and the shaila that I asked was Ir of Derech Pesach. What if there are two chatzeres that had a doorway in between them, and you made an erev together, and then v'nistam Pesach, and on Shabbos something collapsed and it blocked your doorway? Right? We had that shaila before. So now there's a status change. Now you can no longer go from Chatzar A to Chatzar B. Does that ruin the erev? Or Ir of Derech Chaloin v'nistam Chaloin. Or they made an erev because they had an access with the chaloin in between the two properties, and now that chaloin got closed. Mal, what would Allah be? The Amarli, and he paskin for me. I'm not sure if Huna or Yehuda. Shabbos Kibin Hutra. Shabbos, the way Shabbos works is once at the beginning of Shabbos, you were allowed to carry, it's maintained so for the entire Shabbos. And Rashi Hoyel Hutter Mitzvah Shabbos Hutter L'Kula. That's the halacha. So Zok Gemara Itmar. So therefore, in our Mishnah, you have to learn that it was nifritza before Shabbos, because if it was nifritza on Shabbos, there wouldn't be a problem. Once it's considered a good wall before Shabbos, it retains that status quo until the end of Shabbos. Itmar Koshel Shabbat Shnei Chatzeres Shenofal, a wall that was in between two Chatzeres that fell down. And Rashi tells us there was no door in between them and there was no Eruv. So now that it fell down, it's like the original case that we had. What if you got guests in the middle of Shabbos because your neighbors are now sharing your chatzah with you? Rav holds that you could only use it for dalam. In other words, you don't say since it was mutter before Shabbos, it stays mutter. Or Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says no. Once it's mutter before Shabbos, you make believe that the wall is still there, and each party is still allowed to carry to the same area, to the same boundary that they were carrying before, because we say the halacha. Rashi says, "Hoyel v'hutra." Once at the beginning of Shabbos, it was mutter. It's going to continue to be mutter. Zok to Gemara, this halacha that Rav is machmer and says that if the status quo changes on Shabbos, it will become usher. He didn't say it beferish. It was a story that occurred, and from the story we understood what Rav's perspective was. The Rav and Shmuel have a Yosy v'hu chatzar. Rav and Shmuel were sitting together in the chatzar, and nafal guda de beini, and the wall in between the two chatzeres fell down. Exactly the case that we were discussing. Amalu Shmuel. So Shmuel told the olim of there, Shekulu Gilima, take a shmata, take a sheet, Nagiduba, and hang it where the wall was, as if to fix the wall. Adrina Rav Lape. Rav turned around. Rashi the Kashavar Asla Taltla Sabin Shabzoicha. How can you even move the shmata? Rav held once the wall falls down, you can't carry there at all. So Rav turned around to indicate that he wasn't happy with what Shmuel said. Amalu Shmuel. So Shmuel said, I don't understand. If I'm so sure that my psak is right, if Rav has a problem, take his gartel and use Rav's gartel to tie down my new wall. In fact, Gemara, I don't understand. Why did Shmuel even need a wall? If Shmuel holds the ones who was mutter before, why are you making a wall for him? Well, Shmuel Lamali, Ha'amar Zemetatlat Iker Mechitza V'Zemetatlat Iker Mechitza. So you're right. He wasn't doing it for Shabbos. Shmuel loved the Tznius of Alma. He did it for Tznius. He wanted privacy. They were in their private yard, and now their neighbors staring them down. So he wanted to put it back, and he held you were allowed to because you're allowed to carry because you still have your original heter from before Shabbos where the wall was standing. For Rav, Isvir le the Asir Leimale. If Rav held it was Asir, don't just turn around. Tell Shmuel, I'm still not allowed to do this. So tomorrow, ask for the Shmuel Hava. This was the city of Shmuel. Rav would not dare express a halacha in Shmuel's territory, so he just turned around, but he wouldn't protest. If it's Shmuel's city, so don't turn around and make it obvious that you don't like him. Either protest or don't say anything. So he needed to show that he disagreed, so people shouldn't quote him as having agreed with this. But on the other hand, he can't protest because Shmuel held that it would be mutter. Okay, I guess we stop here.
Sure.